All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Patrick Callaway, and I'm hosting this episode of Chebacco Chat, Season 4, Episode 16. So, Chebacco Chat uses a webinar format, so please ask your questions and send comments through the chat or questions and answers feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. When you use the chat feature, you have the option to send a message to the hosts or to everyone, which will include fellow audience members. We will answer questions at the end of the conversation. Chebacco Chats are recorded and are available through our website and YouTube channel 1 week after Eric. This week, we're visiting with Jim Reeverts. His book, Jordans of the Pond, A History of the Family from Jordan Pond House on Mount Desert Island, Maine. Jim is a descendant of the Jordan family, and his new book is a historical documentary detailing the lives of the first Jordans living on the pond that bears their name. In the book, he discusses the challenges of tracking down primary source materials and his process of weaving a story of a family saga from those records. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Right. So, who were the Jordans and how did they come to MDI? We'll go ahead and so we'll have the title slide up with the title to the property.
Yes.
All right. So, who were the Jordans and how did they come to MDI?
Well, there's a vast genealogy of the Jordan family hailing from Dorsetshire, England. And there are over 1,000 descendants of the Jordans in the United States, stemming from a Reverend Robert Jordan, who sailed from England in the late 1600s. His great-grandson, Nathaniel, was born in Biddeford and moved to the shores of the Union River near where Beachland Road is, shortly after his first wife died. He came to the area with his infant child because there were a few of his cousins were living in the area. He remarried as he began farming and got involved with the burgeoning timber business that actually grew Ellsworth in that era. Of the many children they raised 15 children. George teamed up with his younger brother, John, and wanted to get into the lumber business like their father. And I'm guessing this because the details of the transactions were kind of limited. But because he had an older uncle or relative on Great Cranberry, and a John G. Jordan had property that he had mortgaged in the center of the island, that it was likely that they were the ones that tipped him off that there was property that was going up for sale in the late 1830s. And that's how they became interested in the property and then eventually acquired it. They purchased 2,960 acres from a guy already had built the road called Jordan Pond Road today. And then they later purchased a small shore lot that connected the property to Seal Harbor. And it was during that era that their business really started taking off.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Oh, yes, that there's a lot of detail to work with. So, what were some of the challenges and opportunities of researching a family history like this?
Oh boy. Um, I'll take the opportunities first. This was a chance to look deep into my mother's family heritage, which obviously added fuel to my curiosity. I had been visiting MDI and Seal Harbor since I was an infant. I think my first trip, I was 6 months old, according to my parents. My mother lost her mother at the age of 19, and her aunts that lived there in Seal Harbor kind of gathered her in, and when she was able, her father would take her from the Central Maine farm over to the island and they spent lots and lots of time together. So uh, every time we would visit, my mother would not only just cherish the memories, but would get us children excited about Jordan Pond and about the fact that my great grandfather was born there, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Now, I had to be honest that when I started digging into the details, I was a little bit nervous about what I would find. Would it be a good history or would it be a not so good history? And with my mother approaching 90 in 2021, uh, that was sort of my goal, is if I could get this wrapped up or at least a draft done for her birthday, that was a motivating piece. She was always the one that made it a thrilling expedition to go to MDI. And so I wanted to work to honor her. Challenges? Yeah. The first thing I started looking at was our family genealogy, which was a big, thick book of the Jordan family. And I learned quickly that family genealogies have a seedy reputation for inaccuracy. So I wanted to make sure I could corroborate the things that were noted there, both the details of dates and names, but also the comments. And uh, there were quite a few comments about various family members. And so that was a challenge, because I found that in my research that they were not necessarily reliable. There were, by surprise, there were no diaries or journals or photographs of that era in the 1830s to the 1870s, which was awfully curious to me, because when I was working in the Park Service, there were lots of pictures in that era from, for example, the Carroll Homestead family. And I just was curious. Now, I had an aunt that was a history teacher, and I thought for sure there would be a diary left from her. But no, all of my living relatives that were in charge of the estates of these relatives said, no, I can't find anything that would be valuable or helpful. Now, the living members, my mother and her cousins, they have memories and stories of relatives that have been passed down that seem kind of jaded and maybe deserving, maybe not deserving. But I discovered quite a few discrepancies upon further research. And it reminded me of something I read previously about a young researcher who started with her father's glowing report of a great great grandfather, only to discover the report was completely fabricated to cover over a simply horrid past. So going into it, I really didn't know what I would find. And I decided to just brace myself for what possibly might be an embarrassing family history, but probably should be at least recognized, if not told.
So,
So, yeah.
yeah, so taking a look at picture now from view from Jordan Pond, 1881.
Yeah.
So, as we think about what a historian does, trying to shift through all those layers of history and myth and legend and stories that are told, how did you shift through all of that? So you ended up with a history instead of just a story.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, I'll tell you, first and foremost, I had to I had to exercise quite a bit of humility, recognizing that I didn't really know a whole lot. And it was easy for me to just jump to conclusions or romanticize the past or create an initial narrative that would probably be far from accurate. And actually, it was. Uh, Upon the initial surprising discovery of a potential conflict, which I share about in the book. It was a lecture that was given at the Park Service Resource Center, and the guy was telling about George Dorr and his acquisition of property. And he actually, the gentleman chuckled when he mentioned how George Dorr was posting land as private property um, minutes before the lumberman would come to clear cut. Well, all of a sudden, I just realized, oh my goodness, my great great grandfather was a lumberman. Was he the one that was being shut down by this acquisition of land? And I immediately jumped to a conclusion and thought I had figured it all out within a couple days. This is what happened. But when I actually started looking into it, I had to really quench the urge to go with that narrative because it was not even close to being accurate. So humbling myself and insisting and forcing myself to work toward as much accurate information as I could possibly get was the first item of business. Second, Tim Garrity was a person that I went to ask some questions, and he told me early on, some details are just lost to history. And he gave me names of people at University of Maine to talk over, prioritizing data from different sources. And I recognized that sometimes when you can't find exactly what you need, the plausibility or probability can play a vital role. As I started reading around the subject of the Jordan Pond area in my family, while I couldn't find a lot of information about them in particular, reading again about the logging practices in Maine in the 17 and 1800s, reading about mill operations, actually visiting a reconstructed mill from the 1840s, hunting down weather and fire histories, looking at First Nation accounts, at coastal life in New England in the 1800s, it began to help me get a picture of what life most reasonably would look like in that era. And I could apply those to the Jordans where specific information was lacking. And I understood that that was part of the historical method, utilizing factual, non-repeatable data and looking at evidence to reconstruct this historical account became a way for me to weave together the story. Third, there's an increasingly popular genre known as historical narrative. Now, I taught middle school and elementary school for many years, and the generation of kids that I taught learned about the author Lauren Tarsis and her I Survived series for young readers. And she operated out of a model of research and writing that attempted to create interest in historical events by weaving personal details together in such a way as to mimic a novel. So I started applying that process and trying to do the same thing. The difference between historical fiction and historical narrative, it's the refusal to deviate from the historical record, while filling in the details with plausible or probable cause and effect relationships. You stick to the record as much as you can. Now, you'll note when reading my account that I use the words may, might have, possibly, likely to indicate, the tentative nature of my rationale at various points in the story. Mostly, again, due to the lack of the records and because, again, my commitment was to try to be as honest as I could about what I understood to be true. So those are some of the things that I think helped me sort out stories. Like I had lots of stories from my relatives that just were not accurate. And there's plenty of things that you can read, even in Park Service details, that aren't exactly accurate, but they were the reigning narrative at the time. And so that's what was posted. So yeah.
So most of the time when we think of the history of MDI, we think of people who are visiting the island. So how does the story of settlers like the Jordans help us understand our place a little bit better?
Well, okay, I'm from away, and so my perspective is uniquely my perspective. But I believe the story of Mount Desert Island is a story of transformation, both in terms of its inhabitants and in terms of its economics. As with the record of Abraham Soames, the Jordans came not for respite or leisure. Theirs was involvement in the primary and fundamental vocations available in the wilderness, fishing, lumbering, farming. I believe, eventually those things would have naturally given way to further civil and economic pursuits. But the catalyst of the Hudson School of Painters, the Hudson River School of Painters like Thomas Cole, um, they forced the change more rapidly because people just started showing up. For the indigenous families that migrated back and forth to Mount Desert Island, and for the pioneers like the Jordans who forged life from the earth, this was a paradigm shift of huge proportions. Um, for more and more rusticators, summiters would arrive and would buy property and brought their way of life to the island. Less and less the pioneer living and working were possible. The shift economically came in the form, I think, of the service industry, for example. These primarily uneducated but extremely resourceful populations began moving from farming and fishing and lumbering to serving the needs of the people who were now part of the island community. And, there's more to discover in this story. But I think that's the shift that I've become aware of over time. And again, I think that helps understand this sense of place and the shift of life perspective. I know for the Jordan family, one picture that I was hoping to find was a picture of my mother's Aunt Cora, who grew up on the island in Seal Harbor, and she aspired to be a teacher. But before too long, it was clear that along with being a teacher, she would need to have summer work. And so instead of the farming and the fishing and housekeeping, her skills in housekeeping turned to working for the Rockefellers. And I have a picture of her in her maid outfit that to me represents that shift in lifestyle, perspective, economy, etc.
So part of the story of the Jordans that we see in the book is that tension between the family's effort to prosper on the landscape and the environment of the island and the great beauty of the place. So do we get a sense in your research about how the family felt about the island and felt about the place they were at?
I believe, from what I've read so far, their lives had more to do with appreciating the necessity of survival amidst the challenging landscape. But having said that, I can't help but think the striking nature of their surroundings had to have an impact. These were sensitive men. They were faith living men. And the women who grew up on the islands and the children, I think of the children that grew into adulthood there. You know how powerful junior high age emotions can get. Can you imagine that combined with a beautiful sunset behind the bubbles, or just a walk in the forest after a rain to smell the balsam fir? Um, I can't imagine, even if it was only just wiping sweat from their brow and taking a minute to take it all in, that it didn't have some kind of connection to their spirit. And as a result, I'm going to guess that the younger ones would especially have thrown in their lot with efforts to preserve the the landscape, like George Dorr and the Hancock County, um, yeah, that group.
You know, the commissioners.
Yeah, I forgot their name. Thank you. Yeah, I just think that they would grow up with that sense of, yeah, this is beautiful. But initially their nose to the grindstone, getting ready for winter. You know, so
So, what advice would you give to an aspiring historian and a writer from your experience writing this book?
oh boy. uh I think first and foremost, again, you got to humble yourself before the facts as you discover them. I mean, you let curiosity fuel your research, not just your imagination. While it's tempting to skew the facts and figures toward your biases, um, I know I needed to accept when I've taken a tack that proved inaccurate. And that's important, to be willing to follow the evidence where it leads, logically, probability wise. And furthermore, this is not a sprint. Writing a history is a marathon. Now, I never dreamed initially that I would be at this a full decade before assembling this reasonable account. And as I indicated, there's more to discover for this, which may redirect what I've laid out. So I'd say, set yourself in, take the long view. But obviously, the most difficult aspect is to be brutally honest with yourself and relinquish these prize scenarios or written descriptions, and stay in favor of these cold, hard, factual realities that you come across, because people will you will gain people's trust when they recognize the reliability of your efforts, and I think that's a really important thing. And I'm a novice at this process. This is my first real attempt at applying the historical method to an unknown subject that's dear to my heart. So
It's a process.
it really is a process.
It is. All right. So, we have a few moments here, a few minutes to take a look at some of the questions that have come in. A note from Ronald Jordan. Oh,
Oh,
George Newbegin Jordan. That was his third great grandfather. So we
yeah.
have some family here.
All
Nice.
right. Love to meet you in person sometime.
So we have a few moments here. If you have any questions for our author, uh, please feel free now to put it into the chat, and we will get those in the order they come in. Oh, interesting note. Some more here from Ronald. So Everett passed in February of 58 during the completion of the installation of the 12-inch lined cast iron water main laid
Right.
from Jordan Pond to the intersection of Route 3.
How about that?
Well, some more family history coming up.
Yeah. Yeah. That was my mom's uncle Everett. Yep.
All right, so last call. Here we are, a question from Marine. Can you speak more specifically about the business at Jordan Pond? So the sawmill operation, how long was it there? Did they start the service at the first house?
Oh, that's a good question. When they purchased the property, according to the McIntyre history, and also what I found in the records at the National Archives of the Park Service, was that the property already had sawmills on it, and a small camp. The house wasn't built for quite a few years after, about 6 or 7 years after they started work in the mill. Their primary activity revolved around the property around the lake and then down toward the shore in the valley between would be what was called Jordan Mountain, but is now Penobscot. And there's a valley that Jordan Stream follows, and they would clear cut that. But remember, when you talk about clear cutting in the 1830s, uh, this was done by hand, and they were done with axes and those whip saws, those two-person saws. So this was a long process. It was, maybe if these guys were hoofing it, they would get maybe 2 or 3 trees down in an hour. But most likely, those big virgin timber trees took quite a while to fell and to create a path for it to come down to the pond. And most likely, it was done in the wintertime. So they would drag it across the ice, or they would create a path along the edge where they could get their oxen to pull the logs over to where the mill is located. Now, the most probable placement of the mill is right where the spillway is today on the pond, and the little bridge that is part of the carriage road system. Right there at the mouth of the stream is probably where the mill existed. Now, Mr. McIntyre identifies that there were 2 sawmills, but there's such a thing as a double mill in a single structure, as well as 2 individual sawmills. When they talk about a mill, they're actually talking about the saw and the carriage itself, and that constitutes the mill portion of the area. So it could have been done in one building, but I would have to suggest that not only was the water level higher in the pond, but the water level in the stream had to have they had to narrow that stream bed so that it would create a forceful pull on the water wheel to manage 2 sawmills with 1 water wheel. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but their milling activity went on through the Civil War. Now, my great-great-grandfather was killed in an accident in 1863, but his brother John and his oldest son Alden continued the business as long as they could, trying to pay off debts and to service the area businesses with the needed lumber for the Coopers in Seal Harbor, for activity on the shore, the boat building, and housing construction. So it finally finished around 1875. There's a little bit of discrepancy in the records that I read as to exactly when the property was purchased and then rented out to the Tibbetts family. And then finally, the building, the house was sold to the McIntyres in around 1890. So it spanned a good 30 years or so. And as you well know, the more the people occupied the island from away, the more people were so taken by the beauty of the island that lumbering kind of got in the way. They appreciated the trees, they appreciated the forest, and lumbering was slowly becoming less and less not only popular, but pretty much all of the lumber that could be taken and be useful was already harvested. And so it has a natural die out because they don't do what they do now in the replanting and reforestation of areas. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, so another note from Ronald Jordan. He's learning about the story of the mill, mostly unknown in any detail. So, and then Edwin Jordan, 1884
Yeah.
to 1947, Cora's brother had an ice house near where the boat launch is and
Yes.
ran a livery service.
Yes. We actually have some artifacts from that era. My mother's uncle Eddie had he was a quite a versatile fella. He ran like you said, the livery service. We have a nice picture of him in his buckboard getting ready to carry some goods for family. And yeah, he had actually, according to my mother's cousin, he actually had 4 ice houses distributed along the area where the boat launch was one. There was one where the gravel pit is now, and there was another one down further toward where the Seaside Inn Seaside Inn was. Yeah, that's that second generation that that we a lot of people have good stories about that generation. It's the generation before that has always just captivated my attention because there's so little known about that. So
That's another question. Did a fire cause a decline in their business?
absolutely, there were actually 2 fires. Mr. McIntyre records one, and then Street's History of Mount Desert Island records another. But the one in 1864, there's one in 1854 and one in 1864. The 64 fire basically took out the southern half of, or the southeastern portion of the island um, from the Hadlock Ponds eastward to Jordan Pond and southward to the ocean. Street's History says that it basically devastated the business, and he's right in one aspect. It took out all the inventory. It burned the trees. It burned the soil. It actually melted some of the soil. Some of the historiography uh, of the fires. There was a fella from University of Massachusetts Amherst that conducted several core sampling missions on the island over a course of about 10 or 15 years, and they recorded the fires that went back 10,000 years. And he was mentioning how fires such as this take out the ability for a forest to recover quickly. And so yeah, the thing that it doesn't imply is that the buildings themselves were destroyed, because when the estate became up for auction, there were outbuildings still around that were part of the original business. The mills, because they hadn't been used from 1870 on, are described as dilapidated by the 1890s, but they were still around. So the fire could not have obviously burned them and if they did, they were reconstructed. But John and his son, they were already doing other things. If you look Alden is listed as a lighthouse keeper at Baker Island for those times from 1875 for about 5 to 6 years, I think it is. So, yeah, fire played a big role in its basically wrapping up that era of work.
Well, thank you very much for visiting with us about your research. We really appreciate your time and all of your hard work that went into the book. So next
Well,
week episode of Chebacco Chats, we'll visit with Libby Bischoff on her article in the 2023 Maritime edition of Chebacco entitled Lucy's Lens, Life on Mount Desert Rock, 1906 to 1909. This is in 1906. Lucy Dodge moved to Mount Desert Rock with her nephew and her husband, who is the second assistant keeper of the light. So during her time there, she photographed the day-to-day lives of the residents of the Rock. So she will share her observations and research into this collection and to the women who made it. So thank you everyone for coming out tonight, and we will see you again next week.
thank you.